Okay, welcome again, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you all coming out here, especially when the weather is so nice. I'm quite sure you'd rather be outside doing your thing, as would I. I'm Jason Shrest, Senior Transportation Planning Engineer with the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. And we are here at this is the second public meeting for our Battery Street study. I think most of you have been here for a bit, so you've had a chance to take a look at the two options out back. Drew from VHB, who's conveniently walking away, is going to give you a presentation momentarily. I just wanted to set the stage for kind of where we're at with this project and process. We've been focused on the corridor as a whole, as a linear stretch of roadway, namely how the bike infrastructure is likely to play out, and that's what I'm sure you've seen are the key differences between the two options. From this meeting, we are hoping to have a clear direction on what way we're going to proceed with how the bikes are accommodated on the corridor. We have a yet to be scheduled advisory committee coming up, hopefully in April sometime, which at that point, hopefully we'll be able to get the decision on the direction, and then from there, we will be diving more into the granular details of the intersections themselves and how we could further improve those. We didn't want to kind of put the cart before the horse and try to do that for both options if we were going to only proceed with one of them. So that was the thought process there. And then further down the line, we'll also be trying to see what we can do in terms of coming up for recommendations to implement in the short term. That, I think, is all I wanted to say to you all. And from there, I will pass it over to Drew from VHB. Any questions off the bat? Just burning desire, you gotta get it out there. All right. Oh, and you probably heard it, but I am trying to record this meeting so that people who couldn't be here tonight can go back and view it. Couldn't quite navigate the whole hybrid thing, but fingers crossed this recording works out and you'll be able to revisit it for your viewing pleasure, or share it with your friends and family and coworkers. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I think I've spoken with a good number of you here tonight so far, but thank you once more for coming. A lot of the meat of tonight occurred back at those tables, but we're going to provide a more formal overview of the project, get into a little bit more detail about some of the things that Jason touched on, get into each alternative into a little bit more detail. But my goal standing up here is to speak for as short of an amount of time as possible, because the goal is to engage with everybody that came out here tonight. So I would like to hold an open discussion Q&A at the end of the presentation. If a slide comes up that you have a question about, I just ask that you maybe mentally log in and then ask me to come back to it. I'll be able to easily do that on the screen. But for now, I would like to get through this presentation to better inform the alternatives we're considering along Battery Street, and then have an open discussion and encourage everybody to share any thoughts, concerns, questions, what have you. So just as Jason did, he welcomed us, I'll quickly step you through the schedule, kind of echoing Jason's review of the project, give you a brief overview of where we're at, share our finalized purpose and need statement for this project, and then do an overview of the options we're considering. So as Jason said, this project is being run by the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission in line with the city of Burlington. Jason is the project manager on the CCRBC side, and then we're joined tonight by Julia Arsaki at the city, and Laura Waylock is also assisting with the project. Eleni Churchill is here as well as on the RBC. My name is Drew Gingras. I'm the project manager on the consultant side. I'm joined by my colleagues, Karen and Elizabeth, here tonight. Quick recap of what we've done so far and what remains to be done. We had our local concerns meeting last spring. From there, we've had continually ongoing focus group engagements. This is with specific groups of people in and along and around the corridor. That remains ongoing. We have a meeting tomorrow with the Waterfront Action Group, for example. We've completed our existing conditions analysis of the corridor, so this looks at the inventory of utilities, the traffic operations along the corridor, the existing infrastructure, where are the sidewalks, where is the bike infrastructure, where are the nearest connections, how are people engaging with the corridor in its current state. From there, we took the feedback we got at our concerns meeting, what we gathered from the existing conditions analysis, and we developed the options that you're seeing here tonight. Present those to you in a bit more detail now. From there, as Jason said, we will seek to select a preferred option and refine that through discussion with you all here, as well as our advisory committee, ultimately culminating in a presentation to the City Council for approval of the preferred concept and development of a finalized scoping report. So this is just a study. I always think that's important to say at this point in the process. This is a study that will seek to develop options that we will then select one of to hopefully one day further design, engineer, permit, and construct. So the outcome of this is a finalized document with a recommendation. That finalized document will contain the preferred alternative, which will be kind of planned and designed similar to the degree that you're seeing on the roll plans in the back. These are conceptual in nature. They are intended to eventually inform engineering design, potentially be used to apply for additional funding, what have you. So what comes out of this is not only a selected alternative for the corridor of the city, but also a stepping stone into the next phase of the project. So as a quick reminder, we're looking at Battery Street between Maple Street and Sherman Street, abutting, intersecting College Street, Main Street, Cherry Street, a lot of roadways where we know there's a ton of people movement on foot, on bike, by car, connecting at the south end to Maple Street and the future rail yard enterprise project, and then eventually connecting at Main Street with the new Great Street project, which, as you've seen right outside, is currently under construction, and then traveling north to Battery Park and Sherman Street. So the first time we all engaged was in this room, and that was at our local concerns meeting last spring. From that, we gathered a ton of input about driving along Battery Street, about bicycling along Battery Street, about walking along Battery Street, about traveling across Battery Street between the downtown and the waterfront, about commuting from the north end to the south end in South Burlington, about all manner of things on Battery Street. And several things kind of were brought forward, and the key takeaways from those that almost resonated across the board was Battery Street's very uncomfortable. It doesn't feel safe. The crash data that we looked at for motor vehicles would reflect that, and there was definitely consensus that we need corridor safety improvements from the top of Battery Street to the bottom of Battery Street. Beyond that, we need enhanced pedestrian accommodations. It's almost acts at times like a barrier between the downtown and the waterfront. So better facilitating walking and bicycling connections across Battery Street in addition to along it. Dedicated bicycle facilities. For those that travel Battery Street regularly, you know that there is one single bike lane on one side of the road, and that is in the northernmost couple of blocks. There are otherwise no bicycle facilities on Battery Street to facilitate that active mode of transportation. We also heard desires for better community connectivity, getting at not just the downtown district connecting to the waterfront district, but neighborhoods in the King Street neighborhood, in the King Street area, connecting to neighborhoods in the north end and vice versa. And then just streetscape improvements. We heard a lot of people, I think they like the energy that's around Main Street and the improvements that are being done there, the improvements that were previously done along St. Paul Street, and they would like to see that happen along Battery Street as well. Better street ecology, better, more tree planting, more green space, more ways to engage with the street, have it tell a story about the city, about the street itself. Seek out opportunities for better stormwater management. I mean, Battery Street similar to Main Street can become a bit of a waterfall in a proper rain event. How do we mitigate things like that? So we heard all of those, and those were used to better inform and finalize what's called our project purpose and need statement. This is basically our North Star as we develop these options and finalize this study. The project purpose and the subsequent project needs are how we're checking ourselves as we work through this process. With every decision that's made about an alternative or an option, does that get to the project purpose and need? So I can read this for those that might not be able to see it, but it says the purpose of the Battery Street scoping study is to identify and prioritize short and long-term improvements that provide equitable, safe, low-stress, and accessible transportation for all along and across Battery Street, regardless of age, ability, or mode of travel. Beyond that, we bulleted out several project needs, and I'll just read these as well. The need of this project is driven by the deficiencies in the current transportation infrastructure and a need for comprehensive corridor planning. These needs are articulated as follows. We need to improve corridor and intersection safety for all users, to enhance comfort and accessibility for pedestrians along Battery Street. There's a need to provide end-to-end bicycle facilities and critical connections east and west. We need to integrate street ecology into Battery Street's overall design. We need to provide acceptable mobility for all modes of transportation along Battery Street. With that, I'm going to get into a brief overview of the options. Did everybody get to engage with the role plans in the back, or did anybody show up just at the start of this already too long presentation? Wonderful. I think with that, I'm going to work through these pretty quickly. If everybody has already seen them, there's not much more I can share with you, and I'd much rather engage in an open discussion. So a quick overview of option one, though. Option one introduces bicycle facilities separated from the roadway, separated from pedestrian travel, and raised up to sidewalk grade on both sides of Battery Street. These are primarily 6 feet wide. They can vary in some cases to 7 feet wide, particularly the uphill direction is something we would seek to do if this is the preferred alternative. There's also a road diet. We are seeking to reduce the number of motor vehicle lanes along Battery Street, particularly in the kind of middle section where there's a 4-lane cross section. We get a lot of feedback that drivers go way too fast. There's confusion about the lane configurations at turns onto Main Street and College Street. There is, it's very intimidating to walk across the street at some locations with the way just vehicles come down the hill. So addressing that, trying to calm speeds, we've seeked to do that in both of these options. In alternative one, it has a road diet end to end. So there's a reduction of travel lanes in every block. We've also explored the potential implementation of medians in some form or another, and this option I presented between Cherry Street and Pearl Street in the form of a raised and vegetated median to further separate cars, add more green space to the corridor. And there's also a reallocation of parking south of Main Street where there currently exists parking on both sides of the road. This option would have parking in both blocks, but only on one side of the road. This is a high-level typical cross-section. It varies block to block. This mostly is what, for example, the southern 2 blocks would look like, understanding that as we advance north to intersections like Main Street and College Street and Cherry Street, there would need to be the introduction of some turn lanes, turn pockets. I can get into that detail a little bit more when we look at kind of an overview and a side-by-side comparison of both alternatives. So here's a more zoomed in look at one segment of option one. Again, it sounds like everybody was able to see these on the back tables, but key differentiators with option one, the biggest differentiator, as Jason touched on, is the significant difference between option one and option two being the bicycle facilities. Option one has separated and elevated bike lanes on both sides of Battery Street. This is going to match the idea that is under construction on Main Street with this one-way bike travel on both sides of the street. There is options to increase the width of the pedestrian space along the west side of Battery Street, And there, in our case, we are showing fewer parking spaces along the full corridor than option 2. However, I want to put a slight asterisk next to that point, noting that parking and other elements of the road between the options are flexible. So just because we're not showing parking from Main to Cherry Street on the east side of the road, doesn't mean it doesn't fit. There is actually sufficient width for it to fit, but that's a decision we would make based on the info we get among those here tonight and among our focus group outreach as well. So option 2 includes, again, the most significant difference being the bicycle facility. Option 2 includes two-way bike travel along the west side, so the lake side of Battery Street. A kind of example image of how that looks is on the right side of the screen there, with a two-way bike facility separated from the sidewalk, separated from the roadway with a vegetated buffer. There are, again, in option 2, it accommodates the road diet. There is the need, potential need for an additional turn lane at one intersection, being the College Street intersection. And that is because of the right turning volume at that intersection and how it would create a potentially unsafe condition for bicyclists if those right turns were allowed to go concurrently with the bicycle movement. That is not something we would allow. So there's a couple ways we can mitigate that by basically separating those via signalization, is how we pursued it in our options tonight. There's also, similar to option 1, pedestrian signal movements across the board, echoing kind of that feedback we got about crossing Battery Street. Those improvements are implemented in both of these options. Again, I'll get into more detail in the coming slides. And then a key differentiator, again, that is flexible with option 2 and 1, is parking is included in this option all the way up to Cherry Street. There's similarly just another view, rather than looking top down at the corridor. This is what you would see if you were moving up or down Battery Street. You have your travel lanes, your parking, two-way bike lanes on one side of the street, in this case being the west side, and then the pedestrian realm on the outermost areas of the block. Just more kind of the key differentiators of option 2. There, the two-way bike facility, the expanded pedestrian space on the east side where feasible. And so, again, features of both options. Both options employ the road diet, both options. And so that there's, this is again us checking ourselves against the purpose and need. That road diet is critical to improving the safety for drivers and subsequently the impact that drivers have on the safety of more vulnerable users along the corridor. Both options have that road diet, that lane reduction in capacity for motor vehicles. Both options have continuous separated bike facilities. Both options, one thing I didn't touch on, and this is more granular, but the Sherman Street intersection, we didn't hear a lot about that tonight, but the Sherman Street intersection is currently configured, but it's called a slip lane, also known as like a free flow right turn lane. We would seek to modify that intersection, eliminate that to create more comfortable and safer access into and out of Battery Park at that southwest corner of the Battery Street, or Park Street rather, and Sherman intersection. And both options, because of the road diet and the reallocation of that pavement space, would introduce much more green space. Pardon me. So now what we've done in this study is we kind of have looked at these two options kind of side by side. For the most part, they've presented similar benefits, but there are very key differentiators between the two. So this is a high level. I'm going to go kind of row by row in the coming slides and look at these. And again, we're using our purpose and need statement to drive the assessment of each of these options, particularly against a no build, which translates to just leaving Battery Street as it is. So that first need statement, corridor and intersection safety for all users. The bold font here represents the differences between the options, and the gray text represents the similarities. So in our case, the road diet exists along both options. However, in option 2, there is the potential need for an additional right turn lane in that southbound direction to better protect bicyclists. Another piece of feedback we hear a lot in our local concerns meeting is that the roadway, the lane configurations are awkward. They create these awkward lane shifts through the intersection, which feel uncomfortable for drivers. Option 1 minimizes the lane shifts at the intersection. Option 2, given how everything ends up being laid out, eliminates the lane shifts at the intersection. Otherwise, both options, ultimately employ more intuitive lane configurations and eliminate the slip lane at Sherman Street. Pedestrian safety and accessibility. In both options, we've looked at the phasing of all of the signals. This was a big thing we heard. It's difficult to cross Battery Street. I have to wait too long as a pedestrian. I don't feel safe because the cars come super quickly down the hill. So we've looked at, okay, how can, while pedestrian facilities exist along both sides of Battery Street, and for the most part at every single cross street on both sides, how can we make that better? One of the things that will feed a more comfortable pedestrian and a safer pedestrian experience is the road diet. But beyond that, what can we do at these intersections to make walkers feel safer? One of the things we sought to do in our traffic analysis was to implement a 7-second, what's called a leading pedestrian interval. This basically gives you, as a crossing pedestrian, 7 seconds of conflict-free crossing time. So this is where you would be able to enter the intersection and cross before any of the vehicular movements would start to move concurrently with you. Moreover, both options represent, where feasible, an expansion of the sidewalk space. That's a little bit more difficult in option 2 along the west side of the corridor because of the width of that two-way bicycle facility. But in turn, all crosswalks, because of the road diet, are shortened, combined with that 7-second phase where just pedestrians are in the intersection. We think those would represent 2 significant gains to pedestrian comfort and safety at our intersections. Bicycle facilities and connections, you can see every bullet here is bold. This is the most significant difference between the two. As I've gone over, option 1 has one-way separated bike lanes on both sides of the road. Option 2 has two-way separated bike lanes on the west side. Just thinking through some of the benefits for that. Option 1, it's going to match what we're going to see on Main Street when it's built. It's slightly more intuitive. Bicyclists are moving with the travel of motor vehicles. Option 2, while it might be less common and more unfamiliar, it actually has substantial benefits, particularly in the realm north of College Street. That two-way bicycle facility would actually travel north-south completely free of conflict with motor vehicles, which are often the biggest threat to traveling bicyclists, whether in the roadway or separated but traveling through an intersection. Both options are fully separated from the road and pedestrians. Option 2, obviously, you'd be riding side by side counterflow with other bicyclists traveling north-south. That could be less comfortable for people. We've worked on a few projects sharing these paths, but people feel that the speed discrepancy poses a big threat to their safety or just makes them feel less comfortable. That would be a part of option 2 more so than option 1, because you would be riding side by side with counterflow cyclists. Option 1 has, while there are more conflict points along the east side of the corridor, it just naturally produces an easier connection to and from downtown because you're already on that side of the street. Vice versa, option 2, while it does have those areas of less conflict with motor vehicles, there would be naturally the need to, if you're coming from the downtown side or the east side, to cross Battery Street to access that bicycle facility to travel with. So there are pros and cons to both bicycle facilities. Both have pretty much the same impact to the kind of how the roadway space is allocated. Street ecology, both options present a significant increase in opportunity for green space, for bioretention, for stormwater management, which subsequently means they both contain a reduction in the total area of impervious surface. Beyond that, option 2, because of the west side impacts, creeps a little bit more into impacting Battery Park than option 1. And then both options maintain existing trees, some more than others. That's always a design detail, though, that would be more kind of sussed out in the engineering phase of the project anyway. But these, again, are high-level scoping level anticipated impacts. Acceptable mobility, excuse me, I'm trying to get find the words there, for all modes. Parking, obviously always a big sticking point with these types of planning efforts. Option 1 removes on-street parking on one side of Battery between Maple and Main. Option 2 removes parking on one side of Battery between Maple and King. So you do get both side parking in that King to Main block in option 2. Those 2 blocks are the most constrained. So where I mentioned the flexibility of on-street parking, that is more so north of Main Street because of how different the right-of-way is down in those southernmost 2 blocks. Naturally, with the road diet, there is going to be a change in vehicle flow through the intersection. We are inherently taking away travel lanes. We are reducing the capacity of the intersection, so we would expect to see an increase in delay if you are driving along Battery Street in the most congested times of the day. And then transit is another topic we heard a lot about at our first meeting. A study like this isn't necessarily going to explore additional transit stops. That's more a conversation that's had with the transit agency themselves. But what this would do is seek to address the transit stops themselves, the accommodations that are provided. How does the bus interact with the roadway? How does the bus pull out of the road to pick up people? How does it engage with the bike facility? Those are all considerations that we'd be thinking through here. And then obviously mobility for all modes. Both options contain, for the most part, the same pedestrians improvements, namely at the signalized intersection, and both provide end-to-end separated bike facilities. Stacking all of those up next to each other, this is no build, option 1, option 2, side by side. It appeared to us in our analysis that option 2 gets a little bit more at 2 of the needs more than option 1, but option 1 still, we think, accomplishes and accommodates all of the previously identified needs. So for those that are curious what's happening the rest of the way with this study, after we have this meeting tonight, we will re-engage with our advisory committee, which is a group made up of stakeholders along the corridor, the city, the Parks Department, the transit agency, GMT, CEDO, I think, like folks from other agencies and offices in the city. Local Motion is on our advisory committee. From there, we would seek to select and refine the preferred option. That is, as Jason did on, I'll plug it again. The goal, the critical path item is choosing which of these options we are going to move forward and refine and develop into a full scoping report. We would then present our findings in that preferred alternative to the City Council, as well as the CHUC. And eventually, once we have full support, we would finalize the scoping report and develop an implementation plan, which would include identifying elements like critical path next steps to potentially continuing the project into engineering design and hopefully eventual construction, and what that would look like and how we would need to get forward. With that, I'll reintroduce myself again. My name is Drew. I'm the project manager on the consultant side. Jason is the project manager on the CCRBC side. That's our contact information. I will leave this slide up afterward, but our next step is to have open discussion. We have zoomed in aerials of each block of the corridor if we want to go that way, but now I would really love to stop continually talking and engage with you all, answer any questions you have, hear your concerns, hear your ideas to improve our options, what have you. We can do so in this format. If folks would prefer to engage at the tables, we can also go back there, whatever we think is best fit. Thank you all for very patiently waiting and listening to me say all of those words in a row.
I have a question about going north and the left college. How is that? Is there a left turn in or no?
Okay, so the question, just in case anybody didn't hear it, was. That is exactly what I was doing. The question for those that didn't hear it was. How will left turns in the northbound direction along Battery work onto streets? Those that were mentioned were College Street, and Main Street. So I think we have both of those on the screen. So those in option 1, I believe in option 2 as well, there would be a left turn pocket. And that is twofold, I think, in most cases. It is definitely because of the overall lane reduction along the corridor, those left turn pockets, they mostly serve to kind of clear the single through lane of traffic. Oh, thank you for the work as well. Should I get to those numbers? So yeah, there you go. It might be difficult to see, but left turn lane here and left turn lane here back at Main Street. And those are really to make sure left turners have a space to queue and not block through vehicles, because there is such a critical mass in the peak hours. As far as like the phasing of those, I believe we modeled them to have their own phase at specific times throughout the full signal cycle. But those would serve to clear the through lane, and then in some cases where that left turn volume is high enough, best practices for the introduction of a separated bike facility along the corridor state certain thresholds, or if you have left turners or right turners across a bicycle facility, particularly like a two-way bicycle facility, if it exceeds a certain threshold, the kind of the best practice is to separate those movements. So you either hold bikes while the turners go, or you bicyclists, or you hold the left turners or right turners while the cyclists go, to avoid that kind of conflict and crash potential.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is, as a pedestrian, I worry about right on red people coming down College Street and Main Street. Are you going to be able to stop that so that pedestrians can safely cross? And the second question is a lot of this seems like you could get halfway there with paint instead of this huge expensive project that's going to take years to get done. So is there an interim plan to do a road diet with paint?
All right, so question number 1 was concern about blocking up and down Battery Street and the potential conflict with vehicles traveling down the side streets and making right turns, particularly on red signals. I know the city has implemented no turn on red at several high pedestrian use intersections. I believe that's a little bit further down the road of consideration, but I think that is absolutely something that would need to be done. We've called for at Main Street's intersections, for example, all of those intersections, at least the ones that are going to be built in the 3 blocks that are under construction, will all be receiving no turn on red restrictions. That is more and more becoming, I think, commonplace in dense urban environments where there is high pedestrian use. For the simple reason you said, you look one way and then you turn when you're at a red light, and just stopping that, it's been shown, really doesn't do much to impact negatively traffic operations, while it represents a pretty substantial benefit to pedestrian safety. Question number 2 was the long-term plan. Beyond this, it seems like there's a way to improve things in the shorter term with just paint and striping. That's definitely something we're looking at, we're considering. I think step number 1 is going to be to determine the preferred alternative. And then after that is set, particularly around that bike facility, whatever that ends up being, could we potentially implement some sort of interim benefit with striping? And I believe that's a goal of the project. The project purpose is to explore short-term options, but I think that will be determined after we kind of land on a preferred alternative, and could we pilot that in the short-term sense. Any other questions?
So I have 2, I'll just do one at a time. The first one is on the lane width. It seems like both of them are focusing on an 11-foot travel lane. I know that like the VTrans standards for complete streets can kind of suggest a 10 or an 11-foot lane. And I'm wondering why we're leaning towards 11 instead of 10 feet for a road that is still supposed to be 25 miles an hour, right? That's just the city speed limit, right?
So that question was about the lane widths. We're showing in our drawings here 11-foot travel lanes. And the question was, V-Trans says in their complete street guidance that 10 or 11-foot lanes are acceptable. So have we considered 10 lanes? Can we go down to 10-foot lanes? I think 11 feet, it's often considered the minimum if heavy vehicle or transit traffic is prominent along the road, which in our case is. For example, a GMT bus with its mirrors out is 10.5 feet wide. I've worked in other urban environments that have tried to go to a 10-foot lane on transit routes, and there's been several sideswipe incidents, so they prefer to stick with that 11 feet to accommodate those larger vehicles. The roadway volume can also contribute to potentially a need for wider lanes. I know on Main Street we did 12, and that was for the frequency of, well, A, the traffic volume, B, the known volume of heavy vehicles, and C, just the opportunity to kind of pull over and allow pickup drop off and still allow throughput. I don't think we would rule out 10 feet necessarily, but I think at this point in time, given the transit and heavy vehicle volume, that 11 feet is the preferred width.
The second one was smaller and quicker. I think, did you mention that the cycling tracks would be sidewalk level? And if they're separated from the road, would it not make sense to have them be, are there any parts where they might go side by side with the sidewalk? I guess I'm just thinking grade separation from the sidewalk, unless they're just completely buffered on the side.
So they would be at sidewalk grade, but they would be separated from the pedestrian traffic pretty substantially, I believe.
So there's no spot where like the sidewalk goes up against the bike?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, that is something we always seek to avoid with these, because you want to maintain separation of modes. So in this case, we didn't include a width in this cross section, but I don't think it would ever be less than 3 feet. And I think for the most part, it's at least 6.
Sounds good.
That same question.
Same question in option 2. I don't know if we have we don't get much more zoomed in than this. So there might be some localized, I guess to Jason's point, some localized areas. So this is, for example, the building April Cornell's is Burlington Bay. There is, if we were to maintain on-street parking here or add in on-street parking to mitigate potential reallocation of space that is currently used for parking in front of this building, there might be some areas of localized side-by-side travel. However, that's something where when we get into engineering design, if the two-way bike lane there is 12 feet, but 12 feet wide, but we know there's going to be a lot of pedestrian traffic, particularly coming in and out of those buildings, potentially we consider a slightly narrower bike facility in the interest of actually introducing that space that would buffer them from walkers. Yes.
Well, the building I live in is full of elderly people, and they consider Barrier Street. That's one thing, but the trucks are gigantic now. I guess it happened a decade or two ago.
Pickup trucks.
But there's 70-foot trucks, and a lane, whatever they need for a lane should be how wide it is, because they're going to be.
So just to reiterate that comment, this individual shared that he lives in a building with elderly residents, and they often refer to Battery Street as Barrier Street, as it's difficult to cross. If I were to expand that, and beyond that, there's just concern over the amount of large trucks, 62+ foot long tractor trailers, and a recommendation to make sure the lane widths along the street could accommodate those.
Thank you.
I have some questions as well. On the topic of grade separation, when the road meets like bikes or pedestrians occur, is it expected that like the pedestrians and the bikes will be shifting down grade, or are they going to upgrade the road for like pedestrian safety between small cars?
So the question was, at the crossings of the side streets, would the assumption be that walkers and bikers, pedestrians and bikers, would ramp down to the current pavement grade to cross the street and then ramp back up? Or would we raise the crossing points to match the grade of the walkers and bikers? That would definitely be something that I think would be expanded upon and considered more in depth in the engineering phase of the project. A decision like that is often made based upon kind of cross-street volume, and if there is heavy volume going across, if the intersecting roadway is an arterial or a collector and there's no heavy vehicles, things like that. In some cases, those are better served at like T intersections, because then you're slowing a turning vehicle rather than a through vehicle. So that's a practice I've seen implemented in some areas, but very, very specific and very context sensitive. So I think that would be more engineering detail. I'm not sure I can answer that at the scoping level.
All right. And I'm also just wondering, a lot of times when I'm driving through the area, I am curious as to why the necessity of like left and maybe like right turning lanes to College would be necessary when the main connection is right there, and if those turning lanes could hypothetically be removed to get the additional bus stop option as well. Something like that.
So the nuts and bolts of that are, would a removal and subsequent restriction of left turns at College Street be feasible in turn to facilitate that movement at Main Street? Is that?
Yeah, and to reduce the amount of intersections with bikes and pedestrians. Yeah, what was the same part? To reduce the amount of intersections with pedestrians and bikes. And such. Yeah, but you got it.
Just ultimately to reduce the potential for turning vehicles conflicting with pedestrians and bicyclists. That we looked at that option in the traffic analysis, and the findings ultimately suggested that if you were to do something like that, for lack of a better term, you're kind of kicking the can down the road. So you're moving what might be challenged operations at two intersections all to one. It's a little bit predicated on kind of forecasted driver behavior. If you restricted the turns at College Street, would people actually obey it? Would you just be making Main Street much worse or King Street much worse? Are you kind of kicking that conflict down the road? So when we did explore that, we saw enough of a degradation in vehicular operations that to kind of not consider it as a viable option in our alternatives. At this stage, I think that is something that, you know, if the project does move to engineering design, traffic analysis is always revisited. It could be looked at in a different light then.
Between Sherman and Monroe on that block, there's that multiple thread crossing.
Yeah.
How can we address that?
How can we address the multiple threat pedestrian crossing?
Yes.
I think that's a tough spot. We looked at potentially reducing the number of travel lanes, in that northern section. It was tough. The amount of the amount of volume that comes off of Park Street, subsequently off the Belt Line, is very significant. It is also a difficult street to potentially consider something like a raised crossing because of the volume. That would, I think, need to be a little bit more refined in our preferred alternative to see what we could do there. We in our first public meeting, we heard that a lot of people use it almost in spite of how it feels, because one of the considerations was, well, if we were to really improve Sherman Street and make that intersection much safer and more comfortable to cross by eliminating the slip lane, would that pedestrian volume shift up there, or could we drive them down to Pearl Street? And what we heard was that crossing is heavily utilized. We looked at potentially tapering into one lane at the crossing and then expanding it back out, and that didn't seem terribly feasible, but I think it's something that will need to be a continued conversation as we look at how the project evolves. Yeah.
Drew mentioned it though, but I just wanted to highlight the removal of the slip lane at that intersection I do think will have a dramatic effect on increasing the safety of the crossing, because, when people have a green light there, they won't be able to zip around that really wide radius. They'll actually have to slow down to make a turn to go south on North Avenue. I guess in, my personal experience, that, is what I've seen as being like one of the bigger problems of that crosswalk, that people kind of come off of Sherman trying to take a right, like around the park, they're flying around that kind of slip lane, and then all of a sudden the crosswalk is there. So I think just removing the slip lane in general will have a pretty profound effect about increasing the safety of that crosswalk just through slowing vehicle traffic. Did I confuse you, Gene?
No, like, just as a follow-up, has there been a study done on the impact of the backup on North Ave? If you eliminate the slip lane and then its collateral impact on people deciding to go on not Champlain, on Park Street, and so using the connector to be able to do that.
Yeah, that is something that, we've looked at as part of the traffic analysis, what the effects are of taking that out. I don't have, the details of the traffic analysis right in front of us right now, but we are of the understanding that it should still operate at a reasonable level of service, and is one of the lanes or reasons Drew talked about could be neck down Battery Street at that crossing. That's kind of one of the reasons we need that. We need to be able to accommodate that flow. They're going to keep people moving at a reasonable level of service.
Yeah, we wouldn't actually be changing the operations of that intersection. That right turn still functions with the signal. We're just inherently changing the speed at which it can be made during a green light. But we're not actually changing the phasing of that. So I don't believe we foresee a negative impact to traffic or any sort of additional spillback. We're just making it less of a free flow movement, and a movement that'll still be permitted in the same way, but that will need to occur at a much slower rate.
One other unrelated relates to the bus pull off down Battery, I think it's somewhere in between Sherry and College on option 1. What's going to go on with that?
Are you talking about the bus stop that is right here, just south of College Street?
There was one where there was a pull out. I think option 2 had a pull out and option 1 did not. I just like that sort of comparison. Explain a bit.
Yeah, so one versus the other. I think this is one of those elements of each that I would say is somewhat flexible. I think it would kind of be up to coordination with the transit agency. In option 1, the idea is that the bus would stop in the lane. And then in option 2, the idea is that the bus pulls out. I think there's like with anything, there's trade-offs for each of those. So where the bus pulls out, it's more difficult to get back into the flow of traffic. So it benefits motor vehicles because they can still just pass through freely and not really care if the bus gets back in. An in-lane stop, it allows for just better transit operating times, I think, more than anything. The bad behavior that we see with that is oftentimes cars might try to bypass the bus. It'd be nice if we could just have it all.
Thanks.
That would be more a detailed question that would be sussed out and for like Main Street, we have the bus pullouts because that was where we landed with that project. So we have improved shelters and accommodations at the stops. Excuse me, but the buses pull out of the vehicle travel at that.
But it might encourage better bus head times, and if you just were not pulling out now and navigate them.
I don't actually recall if I repeated that question, but for the sake of the recording, question 1 was, will the revision at Sherman Street to that slip lane negatively impact the traffic operations? The answer was ultimately no. And question 2 was, can you just describe in a little bit more detail the bus stop in the northbound direction south of College Street? Yes.
I think one of the main things that'll have to change is people thinking of it as a highway. It's not, North Avenue will be a lot wider and faster than this, right? I mean, North Avenue is 2 lanes on either side.
You're more referring to the new north end?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who feel Battery Street is a highway and then North Avenue is a highway. And they drive it like that. And if you can change their minds about that, then things will work.
Yeah, so the comment was about how in its current state, Battery Street is treated and driven on like it's a highway. That is likely due to the number of lanes, and when it is lower volume, people just inherently feel comfortable driving at a higher rate of speed. Both of these options would implement what's called a road diet or a lane reduction. So our hope would be that with the change in the vernacular of the street, that would naturally by default through engineering design impact positively driver behavior, slower speeds, better compliance at intersections, signalized or otherwise.
Will there be enough room for cars for the police cars and fire trucks to go down there?
Yeah, the question was, will there still be room for emergency vehicles to pass drivers? And the answer would be yes. What are you doing back there, Gene? Just getting rid of the comments you don't like? Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, well, with that, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for engaging. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, second that, thanks for coming. Do you want to chat with us out by the tables? I think we could probably hang out for a little bit longer, so.
We shall see you.